Ashley, since the day you shot my father, I have only had one question to ask you. Why? Why did you end my dad's life knowing he was my only living parent and the only person I could confide in, and count on for everything I needed as I turned into a young adult? Why did you willingly take away your daughter's father, knowing the consequences of your actions would leave her without either parent to help her navigate through her own life? You somehow managed to orphan not one, but two young girls. Unlike Emerson, I am fortunate enough to have known my dad for a full 19 years before you ended his life.
The ballerina pulled the trigger. Her husband collapsed to the floor. The room went silent. But was this cold-blooded murder, or a desperate fight to survive? If I didn't shoot him, I wouldn't be here today. Those were Ashley Benefield's words. She was once a graceful ballerina, trained to move with elegance and poise. He was Doug Benefield, a Navy man chasing big dreams. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect couple, beauty and discipline, grace and strength. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. What began as romance turned into rage, and in the end, it all ended in blood. I'm your reporter, here to walk you through one of the most shocking cases America has ever seen. A love story that spun out of control and ended with a husband dead on the floor. Before we pull apart this unbelievable case, hit subscribe right now. Because the next story we cover might be the one that saves your life, and you don't want to be the person who looked away. Ashley Benefield was born into a world of elegance and discipline. From the time she could walk, she was taught to point her toes, stretch her arms, and move with the grace of a swan across the stage. Ballet wasn't just a hobby, it was her identity. She grew up in studios filled with mirrors and music, a place where every movement had meaning. Audiences saw a beautiful dancer gliding across the floor, but behind the performance was a young woman who carried enormous pressure. To be perfect, to never miss a step, to always smile even when her body ached. Doug Benefield came from a different kind of stage. He was a Navy man, a life of uniforms, order, and rules. He had seen the world through missions, training, and the kind of discipline only the military can teach. But when he left the service, Doug wasn't ready to slow down. He turned his energy toward business, chasing new ventures, dreaming big. He wasn't just a man in uniform anymore. He wanted to build a future, a family, and a legacy. Two lives that should never have crossed somehow collided in the most unexpected way. Their meeting felt like fate, a chance encounter that turned into late-night conversations, laughter that came easy, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they had found the missing piece of themselves in each other. And when passion takes over, reason often takes a back seat. Their romance moved quickly, faster than most could keep up with. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Dinners turned into shared apartments. Private whispers became public promises. To friends and family, it looked like they had skipped the slow dance of dating and jumped straight into the final act. Some smiled and called it love at first sight. Others, though, whispered behind closed doors, "This is too fast." They barely know each other. The doubts were there, unspoken but heavy in the air. Still, Ashley and Doug didn't seem to care. To them, the world outside their love didn't matter. In 2016, they sealed their story with vows, a wedding that felt like the beginning of forever. She walked into the marriage as the ballerina, delicate yet strong. He stepped in as the Navy man, steady and determined. Together they looked like a perfect match, the kind of couple people photograph and admire. But perfection, as we often learn, is fragile. What photographs couldn't capture were the shadows growing just out of sight. Money problems, stress, clashing personalities. Behind the smiles there were whispers of tension that no one wanted to believe. Because from day one, there was always a question in the air. Had they moved too fast? And sometimes, fast love burns out the quickest. The early glow of marriage faded faster than anyone expected. What had begun as a whirlwind romance soon collided with the harsh weight of reality. Doug's dream was to give Ashley and their new family stability, but stability came at a price. He had left the security of the Navy behind and was chasing business ventures that demanded money, attention, and time. They moved suddenly, hoping that a change of scenery would help them reset. A new house, a new town, a new start. But instead of fresh beginnings, the walls of that home began to echo with stress. Bills mounted. Projects failed to deliver. Money slipped through their fingers faster than it came in. Doug pushed forward, determined to build something lasting. Ashley, who had stepped away from the ballet world, was left to adjust to a life far removed from the stage lights. The elegant costumes, the applause, the structure of rehearsals, they were gone, replaced by the daily grind of uncertainty. The tension wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was silent, Doug working late into the night, Ashley sitting alone, both of them feeling the distance grow. But other times, it boiled over. Arguments sparked, sharp words flew, and neighbors would later admit they heard raised voices from inside. Then the accusations began. Ashley confided in others that she felt unsafe. She described Doug not as a loving husband, but as a man who controlled her every move. She claimed that he shoved her, blocked her from leaving rooms, and once struck her. Doug told a different story. To him, these weren't cries for help. They were weapons. He denied ever laying a hand on her. He said Ashley was twisting arguments into abuse, using fear as a strategy to cut him out of their daughter's life. It became a war of words, fought not just in private but in public records. Ashley filed for protection, claiming she needed a restraining order to keep herself and her daughter safe. Doug countered, insisting the claims were false and that Ashley was trying to manipulate the system. Courtrooms and case files became their battleground. Judges reviewed paperwork filled with contradictions, Ashley's statements of fear against Doug's insistence on lies. Each hearing left more questions than answers. And through it all was their young daughter, a little girl who never chose this fight. To Ashley, she was a child who needed shielding from an abusive father. To Doug, she was a daughter at risk of being used as a pawn by a mother desperate for control. Both sides documented everything. Ashley kept notes of incidents she said proved her fear. Doug collected evidence to show she was fabricating. Police reports were filed, lawyers drafted arguments, and every page painted a different story. To outsiders, it was impossible to know what was real. Friends and family were split. Some believed Ashley, some defended Doug. Every claim had a counterclaim. Every allegation had a denial. It was a marriage no longer built on love but on paperwork, fear, and distrust. And that was the problem. There were two versions of the truth. Ashley's version painted her as the victim of a dangerous man. Doug's version painted him as the target of a vindictive woman. Each side kept notes. Each side told their story. But the real truth was buried somewhere between. By now, the marriage was no longer about love. It was about survival. And in the middle of the storm stood one little girl, too young to understand why her parents were suddenly enemies, too small to know why every adult around her spoke in whispers of fear and anger. Ashley said she was protecting her daughter from a dangerous father. She claimed Doug's temper wasn't just aimed at her. It could one day turn toward the child. She painted herself as the shield, the only barrier between innocence and harm. Doug fought back with equal force. To him, Ashley was the threat, not through violence but through manipulation. He insisted she was poisoning their daughter's future by dragging her into lies, using the child as leverage to control him. Lawyers filed motions. Judges listened to testimony. Each parent presented themselves as the safer choice, the better guardian, the only one who could be trusted. But at the heart of it all was a child who had no voice in the battle being waged over her life. One child caught between two adults in a storm of hate. The courtroom saw stacks of paperwork, restraining orders, custody petitions, emergency filings. Each page carried accusations that tore deeper into the already fractured family. Ashley claimed she feared for her safety every day. Doug claimed those fears were fabricated to keep him away. Outside of the legal papers, the emotional war was just as intense. Friends were pulled into the middle, asked to take sides. Family members watched helplessly as the relationship they once celebrated unraveled into bitterness and distrust. And while Doug fought to prove he was a good father, Ashley began telling a larger story, One of survival, of abuse, of living with a man she said she could no longer escape. She said this wasn't just about custody. It was about life and death. Each hearing ended without clear answers. Each decision left one side furious, the other side terrified. And the little girl? She remained at the center, a symbol of innocence trapped in a war she never asked for. The tension grew unbearable. Everyone knew something had to give. But no one could predict how far it would go, because Ashley wasn't just fighting for her child, she was fighting for her life. At least, that's what she said. It was September 27th, 2020. The Florida heat had begun to fade into evening, but inside the Benefield home, the tension was just beginning to rise. Doug arrived that night carrying more than just the weight of divorce papers and legal battles. He carried frustration, anger, and a desperation to be heard. Months of arguments over custody, restraining orders, and accusations had led him to this doorstep. For Doug, this wasn't just another confrontation. This was his chance to stand his ground, to demand answers. Ashley was already inside, her nerves tight, her heart pounding. She claimed she feared what was about to happen, that Doug's presence wasn't just unwelcome, it was dangerous. She had said it before, that when Doug was angry she never felt safe. Tonight, she believed, could be the breaking point. The argument began like so many others. Sharp words exchanged across the room. Old wounds reopened. Finances, custody, accusations of abuse, every unresolved issue now colliding all at once. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices echo through the quiet neighborhood, but no one could see what was happening behind those walls. Ashley said Doug's temper flared, that he came toward her with rage in his eyes. She said he blocked her path, that she couldn't escape. That in that moment she felt cornered, as if every fear she had written in court filings was suddenly coming true in real time. But Doug wasn't there to defend his version. His voice, his side of the story, ended in that room. What we know is this: at some point, Ashley reached for the gun. A flash, a sound that shattered the night. The shot ripped through the air, cutting through years of love, months of bitterness, and seconds of fury. Doug collapsed. The Navy man, the entrepreneur, the husband and father, fell to the floor. His life ended where his marriage had already broken. The room went silent. No applause, no audience, no curtain call. Just Ashley standing over the man she once promised to love forever. A ballerina who had traded pirouettes for a pistol. And then came the call that still chills investigators today. "My husband's been shot. Please, send help." I had to do it. I had no choice. On the other end, the dispatcher kept calm, guiding Ashley through a storm of panic. But the sirens rushing toward the house couldn't bring Doug back. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Doug Benefield, a father, a veteran, a man who once believed in second chances, lay lifeless on the floor. No neighbors saw it. No friends witnessed it. Just Ashley, and Doug's body at her feet. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the dark Florida night. Sirens fell silent as patrol cars lined the street outside the Benefield home. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering, wondering what could have happened inside the house, where fights had so often broken the quiet. When investigators stepped through the front door, they were met with chaos. Doug lay motionless on the floor, his body still, his life already gone. Standing nearby was Ashley, pale, shaking, and holding on to the only explanation she had left. "Self-defense," she told them. She repeated it over and over again. "I had no choice. He was going to hurt me. If I didn't shoot, I wouldn't be alive right now." The detectives listened, notebooks in hand, recording every word. On the surface, her story sounded like survival. But investigators are trained to look beyond words. They looked at the scene, the angles, the distances, the evidence on the floor, and already things didn't seem to add up. They photographed the position of Doug's body, the shell casings, the blood patterns. They noted Ashley's calmness in some moments, her trembling in others. They studied her face, her tone, the way her story shifted slightly with each retelling. Ashley insisted Doug had come at her. She said she had been cornered, trapped. She painted herself as the victim of an abusive man who finally pushed her to the breaking point. But the physical evidence told a different story, one of distance, of space between them, of possibilities that didn't quite match her words. Investigators began to see the shooting not as an act of desperation, but as something more deliberate. To them, this wasn't a ballet of survival. It was a performance of murder, and yet nothing was simple. Ashley's claims of abuse were backed by paperwork, restraining orders, filings, testimony she had given before. Doug was no longer alive to refute her, no longer able to defend himself in person. The case was now balanced between two extremes: a woman who said she had no choice, and evidence that suggested she may have chosen this path long before the trigger was pulled. The investigation was only beginning. Detectives pressed Ashley, challenged her timeline, compared her words to the crime scene. Every answer she gave raised new questions. So what really happened that night? Was the ballerina lying? Or was she trapped in a role she couldn't escape? The trial of Ashley Benefield was not just another case on the docket. From the moment it began, the courtroom felt like a theater, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the woman once known for pirouettes and elegance. Now she sat behind the defense table, dressed simply, hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for 12 strangers to decide whether she would walk free or spend decades in prison. The prosecution came out strong. They didn't ease into their case, they hammered it from the start. She wanted him gone, the lead prosecutor declared, pointing directly at Ashley. This wasn't survival, this was strategy. She knew Doug stood between her and custody of their daughter, and so she made a choice. She decided that if Doug was out of the picture, she would finally have what she wanted. Their story was sharp and deliberate. They laid out financial stress, restraining order filings, and bitter custody disputes as pieces of a puzzle that ended with Doug dead on the living room floor. To the state, Ashley was not a victim, she was the architect, but the defense had a very different picture to show. They rose to their feet and, with calm intensity, told the jury, "This is not the story of a woman who plotted murder. This is the story of a woman who endured abuse, manipulation, and fear. On the night of September 27th, she had two choices: die at the hands of her husband or protect herself. She chose to live." The battle lines were drawn. One by one, witnesses were called. Detectives described the crime scene, the gunshot wound, the blood patterns, the evidence that didn't match Ashley's first version of events. They noted the space between her and Doug when the bullet struck, suggesting distance, not a close-quarters attack. To the prosecution, that distance proved intent, not desperation. Then came those who knew the couple personally. Friends testified about conversations with Ashley. Some recalled her confiding in them, saying Doug had a temper, that she was terrified, that she didn't know how much longer she could endure. Others, though, spoke of Doug as a gentle father, a man who adored his daughter, who never showed signs of violence. The contradictions piled up. On cross-examination, the defense fought to dismantle the state's claims. They pressed investigators on why there were no cameras, no direct witnesses. They pointed out that paperwork Ashley filed months earlier, the restraining orders, the police reports, were not invented after the fact. They had existed long before the shooting. The prosecution pushed back harder. They suggested those filings were part of a calculated plan, building a paper trail so Ashley could later claim self-defense. To them, it wasn't coincidence. It was premeditation. The courtroom became a chessboard. Each side moved carefully, strategically, trying to control the narrative. The jurors sat silently, absorbing every word, every contradiction, every emotional outburst. Doug's family sat in the gallery, watching the woman who had ended his life. Ashley's supporters sat on the other side, insisting she had done only what she had to do. The divide was sharp, the atmosphere suffocating, and through it all, Ashley herself remained a puzzle, sometimes teary, sometimes expressionless, sometimes leaning in to whisper to her attorneys. To the jury, was she the picture of a battered wife, or the mask of a calculating killer? Every hour of testimony raised new questions. Every statement added a new layer of doubt, or a new weight of certainty. In the end, it came down to this. The prosecution argued she wanted freedom, control, and custody. The defense argued she wanted safety, peace, and survival. Two stories, two versions of the truth, and every word spoken in that courtroom carried consequences, not just for Ashley's reputation, not just for Doug's memory, but for her very future. Because in that moment every word could mean life, or 30 years in prison. The trial had stretched on for weeks, witness after witness, file after file, each side fighting to bend the truth toward their version of the story. But now, it all came down to 12 strangers. The jury was sent out to deliberate. Behind closed doors they carried the weight of 2 lives, Doug's already gone, and Ashley's hanging in the balance. Inside the deliberation room, hours ticked by, papers shuffled. Voices rose, then fell again. Some jurors argued for murder, saying Ashley had plotted, waited, and executed. Others pushed for sympathy, pointing to her history of filings, her claims of fear, her quiet demeanor in the courtroom. Back in the gallery, the families waited. Doug's relatives clutched hands, whispering prayers that justice would not be denied. Ashley's supporters sat silently, their faces tight with dread. The air was thick, every cough, every creak of a chair sounding louder than it should. Then, the word spread. The jury had reached a decision. Everyone stood as the jurors filed back in, their faces unreadable. The clerk unfolded the slip of paper, the judge nodded, and the courtroom froze. Ashley sat at the defense table, her hands trembling now, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to look straight ahead. The judge's voice cut through the silence. On the charge of second-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. Gasps echoed through the room, but it wasn't over. The judge continued. On the charge of manslaughter with a firearm, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The words landed like a hammer. Ashley broke down, her head falling into her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. Behind her, her mother clutched her chest. On the other side, Doug's family cried openly, relief, grief, and anger mixing all at once. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Some wept, others muttered under their breath. The judge's gavel struck hard, demanding order, but the verdict had already shattered the fragile calm. For Ashley, it meant years behind bars. For Doug's family, it meant some measure of justice, though nothing could bring him back. And for the daughter caught in the middle, it meant growing up without both parents, one buried, one behind prison walls. The verdict was read, the case was decided, but the questions would never end. The courtroom was silent as the judge returned to his seat. The gavel struck, not to call order but to mark the end of a case that had gripped an entire community. After weeks of testimony, months of headlines, and years of whispers, there was only one thing left to decide: Ashley Benefield's sentence. The room held its breath as the judge spoke. 20 years in prison, followed by probation. The words cut through the air like the final note of a song no one wanted to hear. Ashley closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking, as reality sank in. The ballerina who once moved effortlessly across stages now struggled to breathe beneath the weight of a 2-decade prison term. Deputies moved in quietly. They didn't rush her, but the message was clear. Her freedom was over. Handcuffs clinked around her wrists, replacing the delicate bracelets she once wore. Chains replaced ribbons. A prison van would replace the spotlight. Doug's family sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, their faces wet with tears. His sister leaned forward, whispering, "It's over. Finally, it's over." For them, justice had not brought joy. It never could, but it had brought a measure of peace. Doug would never come back, but at least in their eyes, his story had been heard. Ashley's supporters, though, shook their heads. To them, this was not justice, but another tragedy layered on top of the first. They believed the system had failed her, that a woman who claimed survival was being punished for protecting herself. In their view, the verdict was a second death sentence, one that erased her future just as surely as the bullet had erased Doug's. 2 families, 2 truths, 2 worlds forever divided by one gunshot. And now, a daughter would grow up with neither parent, her father buried, her mother behind bars. A child carrying the legacy of a love story that ended in horror. A ballerina who once danced under the lights, now wakes up behind bars. Doug's family calls it justice. Ashley calls it survival. And the truth? Only 2 people knew it, and one of them is gone. It is a story that leaves no easy answers. Was Ashley a victim who finally reached her breaking point, or was she a woman who chose control over compassion? The courts made their decision, but the deeper truth, that remains sealed inside a house where no one else was watching. As the story closes, the images linger. Ashley in shimmering ballet costumes, captured in photos mid-pirouette, her face calm, her body precise. Doug in his Navy uniform, smiling proudly, a man once defined by honor and discipline. 2 photographs that tell of grace and strength, yet end in tragedy. Silence fills the room. And in that silence, one thought remains: some stories never end. They live on in questions, in grief, in what-ifs. Ashley Benefield will spend the next 2 decades waking up behind bars. Doug Benefield lies beneath the earth, his dreams unfinished. And their daughter will grow up carrying both their names, and the shadow of what happened that September night.